Hey everybody, it's James Rock, and welcome back to On Whose Shoulders Do We Stand? I am here today with one of my favorite Christian camping professionals of all time. This is Bob Tissot. Bob Tissot was actually my cabin leader when I was a high school camper at Bair Lake Bible Camp way back in the day, and all sorts of stuff like that. But we're going to get into the details. Welcome, Bob, to the podcast. How you doing today?
Thanks very much for having me. As I always say to everybody, how you doing? Unbelievable.
Excellent. Excellent. Now, Bob, you were the director of Bair Lake Bible Camp for how many years?
29.
29 years.
Yep.
So tell me, how did you get from being just a regular old person to getting on staff at Bair Lake?
God. My story, I went to camp when I was 8 years old, not Bair Lake. I hated camp.
Hated camp.
Hated it. Why? The counselors were terrible.
Oh.
They didn't connect with us. And I remember the kids from one place were trying to smother the kids with pillows from the other place and the other way around. And all I remember is I went home after the week at camp, and my dad called me up into his room and said, "Son, how did you like it?" And I looked at him and I said, "Dad, I will never go back to camp again the rest of my life."
Wow.
At 8 years old. And I didn't. I was an athlete and a good student, and I was involved with sports and all kinds of things, and went off to college and played college sports.
Wheaton College.
Yep. Wheaton, Illinois. And I, in the process of all that, then I got a job teaching in St. John's, Michigan, at St. John's Public School, St. John's High School. And I began coaching, and then I began working on a master's degree in counseling. And a gentleman from Bair Lake Bible Camp named Dick Bunce would come to our chapel once a year in May. Mm-hmm. And he would look at me and he would say, "You need to come to Bair Lake Bible Camp to volunteer for a week." And I would look at him and I would say to him, "Dick, I'm coaching sports. I'm working on a master's degree. I had a girlfriend at the time." I said, "I'm just too busy." No. Came back the second year. "You need to come to Bair Lake Bible Camp." "Dick, work on a master's, coaching sports, got a girlfriend." No. Third year, same thing. The fourth year, I'd finished my master's degree. I was the varsity basketball coach, and I gave the kids 3 weeks off during the summer where I said, "I don't want you to touch a basketball. I don't want you to have anything to do with basketball. Just be with your family." And the young lady told me that I was history. Dick shows up at our church. Dick says, "You need to come to Bair Lake Bible Camp," and I had no excuse not to.
Oh, wow.
And matter of fact, Dick is aging, and I just spent some time with him, and I used the analogy in the Bible about the woman that was persistent with the judge. Uh-huh. Kept going and asking, and finally the judge said, "Fine." And it's almost like that's my story, is I did not have an excuse, still didn't really want to, but I didn't have an excuse. So I said, "Well, okay, I'll give you 3 weeks."
So not just one, all 3 weeks.
So I went all 3 weeks. The first week was like junior girls. Uh-huh. So they put me out in a rowboat out in the middle of the lake, watching the canoers and everybody else. But at that point, I started to work with the other staff and had conversations. And then the next 2 weeks was what camp called at that point young teens. Uh-huh. And so they put me in a cabin as a co-counselor with a very experienced missionary from Africa.
Oh, wow.
Kind of like to make sure we're not sure this Tissot guy is any good or not. Uh-huh. So let's just get somebody that covers for him. After the first week, they saw I had done pretty well, and so they put me in the hardest cabin that they were having trouble with. And at the end of those weeks, especially the last 2 weeks, I had formed some friendships and relationships. I had seen the power of young people getting away from home, getting away from things, to be able to have deep conversations, to be able to think on who they are, what they believe, how they do things, what's the reality of Jesus Christ, how does all this work. In essence, I kind of fell in love with the concept of Christian camping.
What year was that about?
It's about 1980, no, 1978, 1979.
1979. Okay. And so
Yes.
then you start going to camp every summer following that time?
Pretty much. I started to go to camp every summer for the 2 weeks of teen camp.
Okay.
I did not go to the 3 weeks or anything else.
Okay.
But I would go and I would work at teen camp, and there were things that, as an educator, in running a Fellowship of Christian Athletes in the public school that I was in, I'd begun talking a lot about relationships. And the kids in the public school they'd come to FCA, and I'd have 100 kids coming just to talk about relationships. And when I got to Bair Lake, the teen camp was talking about relationships.
Wow.
And so it was a kind of a natural merging for me. And so I began to take on more and more. And then the gentleman, Jim Wallace, who was the director of the teen camp, said, would you come in and be my program director for the week?
Okay.
Because camp at that time didn't have permanent staff, or basically the permanent staff was maintenance guys and a director. And so everybody kind of did their own program during the summer. And so I went, and from there, just things began to grow. Interesting stories for me, because the story of Christian camping it's someplace I never expected to be.
Yeah.
And yet God did some things that are absolutely incredible.
So our paths are going to cross here in a minute, because I grew up, when I did go to church, I had divorced parents, so I wasn't at the Countryside Gospel Chapel much, but our families were both attending that church, and somewhat rival families, but we don't need to go into those details. Lots of interesting stuff there. But I knew of you as the cool guy that was at church sometimes. And then eventually my grandparents send me and my sisters to Bair Lake. I do it in grade school, 5th, 6th grade. I get saved at camp that summer, then go back home, trying to figure it all out, come back as a high school staff, camper. I'm in your cabin, which was one of the coolest weeks of my life. But we won't get into details on this one, but at one point during that week, I was chased with a chainsaw through the fort, but you were the cabin leader. You weren't responsible for that programming moment in time, but that's that old school 80s camp kind of a world, right?
Yes. And this is my disclaimer to everybody out there. I had absolutely nothing to do with any of that. Everything I did was exactly right all the way.
They took the chain off the chainsaw, which we realized as they got closer to us. But it was a haunted fort kind of thing.
Yes.
But rededicated my life that week. Eventually came back and was on summer staff there, and then eventually was their first intern hired in the 1988. I was a maintenance intern, which makes no sense, but that's what I was. And then during that process, management was looking to change, because that camp had gone from a off-site director who was a teacher, and basically he was kind of running camp from afar, and a couple maintenance guys that lived on site with me, the intern. And then it comes to the day where you get hired. So how did you get hired at the camp?
They were desperate. They were really desperate.
Yeah.
The story goes on is that I then met my wife 2 years after I started going there.
Okay.
I met Nancy at Bair Lake Bible Camp, whose family had been amongst the founders, and they had been involved in all of this kind of stuff. She had gone, she was working on a degree towards physical therapy, and she'd been away from camp my first 2 years. In the third year, she shows up, and all of a sudden, she starts talking to me, because I am 11 years older than my wife. And she starts talking to me more as a father figure, kind of looking and saying, I'm having trouble with my cabin, and you're a counselor, and help me and everything else. And all of a sudden, we kind of I decided, this is an awesome woman. And so our relationship grew, and we went and we got married. In our time that we talked about getting married, we were both involved in volunteering. We're what they called house parents at Bair Lake, where we went into a junior staff house and watched kids, and we'd do that for a week or so of the summer, and then we'd go to camp for other weeks, and she did some directing of weeks. But when we got married, we had this conversation, and Nancy looked at me, and Nancy said, I just want you to know, Bob, that I don't ever see us going into full-time Christian ministry.
Yep.
And I looked at her and I said, that's fine with me. I'm doing very well in the school setting that I am. I'm counselor. I was the director of the counseling program for the school system. She was a physical therapist working in Lansing, Michigan, and we were doing really well. And I thought, we're involved in our church and active and involved in camp. And then over time, people began to talk to us and say, would you come and work with these young people, And we went to one church and we met with them and talked with them. And on the way back, Nancy's in the car with me and we're just talking, what do you think? And she says, Bob, if we would consider any of these other places, why would we not consider Bair Lake Bible Camp?
Wow.
And I looked at her and I said, number one, they don't have any money to pay us.
Yep.
And number two, I don't know. And she looked at me and she said, well, I guess if we're following the Lord, that's probably not the best excuse in the world to use. And I looked at her and I said, don't get spiritual with me now, woman.
Yep.
And so we began this talk of, would we do this? And at this time, camp was at a struggling time in its existence. Things were getting harder and harder. And you go into the history of camp, and it founded in 1957, and there's some vibrant, alive things, and then some things happened, and I call it like the era of the 80s was the era of transition. Mm-hmm. And it was just getting harder and harder, and camp was not doing well. The guy who had invited me to come to camp left camp. Mm-hmm. They had one gentleman that came in for 3 years. It didn't work very well. Another guy came in for 3 years. And then the guy that you just described, that was a teacher, came down and he ran it from Muskegon, Michigan. He'd come to camp and he was the kind of the director from a distance.
And that wasn't uncommon for camps back in the 80s in that window where they would have these camps that are running mostly in the summer, not a lot of winter stuff, but depending on the camp, and then not a lot of staff either. Whereas today, staffs tend to have, camps tend to have decent sized staffs, but then, the directors offsite, the accountants offsite, the people that are doing all those things, the boards, are offsite. They're trying to kind of keep the camp together. It barely. At the time, there was a maintenance guy, Ralph, another maintenance guy, Matt, and me, the intern. And then, so who convinced you to actually be the executive director?
We prayed about it a lot. Nancy and I, we knew camp needed somebody. The guy that you described, Wayne Baumgars, one of my life mentors, who just this past year passed away. Yep. And he looked at me and he said, you need to come here. And there were 3 or 4 other people, some board members, and when they knew camp was struggling, they'd gone through these hard stuff, several people came up and said, you need to come here and run this place. And I looked at them and I said, are you praying? And they'd say, yes. I said, you better pray harder because at this point in time, I feel no call to come here.
Wow. And
there was a group of people that were praying, and slowly the Lord began to change our hearts and our minds. We went to the chapel that we were at, Carriage Hill Bible Chapel in East Lansing, Michigan, and met with the elders. They had already said no to one couple from Carriage Hill that was talked about going to Bair Lake to try to help it out.
Oh, wow.
And they said no to them. So when I went to the elders, when Nancy and I went to the elders, I thought, well, they're going to say no to us too. And the head elder looked at me and said, this is a completely different situation. And so we began conversing with the people at the chapel to see if they would stand with us in going. Mm-hmm. We began to meet with the Wayne and Sharon Baumgars just to talk to them. And then we met with certain people that were key to us. Mm-hmm. So we met with both sets of parents, my parents, her parents, and we felt this call that, are we willing to step out this way?
Wow.
And it was, I'll be honest with you, it was scary. Because again, they didn't have money to pay us. And we, at that time, as a director of student services in a big public school and a physical therapist, we were making good money.
Yeah.
And you hear all those things that you're taught as a Christian and a follower of Jesus. He will supply all of our needs according to his riches and glory.
Uh-huh.
That's a nice verse to quote, and sometimes it's harder to live it out.
Yeah.
And so we went and we talked, and I'll never forget, we went with Wayne and Sharon, and we met in Muskegon Mall, had dinner, and we walked the mall and talked about camp. And should we come? And of course, they were, yes, you need to come. Yes, we're ready. Nancy and I prayed. We met with our parents. And you talk about interesting stories. My parents they were so good about attending church. So Wednesday night was prayer meeting night. And we were getting towards the end of the decision. And the only night we had to meet with the parents before there was a board meeting on that Saturday was on Wednesday night. And we wanted the approval and support of our parents because we knew we were taking a step of faith.
Yeah.
Called my dad and I said, Dad, any way that you can come and have dinner with Nancy and I, you and Mom have dinner with Nancy and I on Wednesday night? He said, absolutely. And I said, what? And he goes, we have a missionary coming this week to the Wednesday night service, but he could only come on Thursday. So we moved this service to Thursday. So we got Wednesday open.
For the first time ever, yeah.
For the first, it's like, you got to be kidding me.
Yeah.
And so my parents came, and we remember talking to my parents, because one of Nancy and my prayers was, number one, that we would agree together on going into the ministry. Mm-hmm. Number two, that our parents would be supportive of us. Because we had 2 kids with a third one in the future, very near future.
Yeah.
My dad looked at me, and I expected my dad to kind of give me the talk about taking care of the family and a growing family and all those things. And the first words out of my dad's mouth were, if the Lord's calling you, you got to go. And then he did all the other stuff. We then met with Nancy's parents, whose father was a builder and a very factual kind of guy, loved the Lord. And we looked and we said, I don't know. And they were coming back from Massachusetts and visiting one of their kids. And they said, we're going to stop by on Thursday night. And they stopped by and we presented it to them. And the first words out of his mouth is, I wish I had done something like that with my life before.
Oh, wow.
And it was just like some verification. So I called Wayne and I said, yes, you can put my name, you can put Nancy and my name in the board. But we need to talk about job description. We need to talk about benefit package. We need to, all those things. So maybe the board can work on that and get back. And he said, okay, fine. So he called me Saturday night because the board meeting was Saturday. He called me Saturday night, answered the phone, and he said to me, he said, you're in. And I said, what do you mean we're in? He says, I told the board you're willing to come, and everybody voted and said yes. And I said, okay, so what about the packages and the job? Oh, we'll take care of all of that later.
Yep.
And so we made a commitment to go to Bair Lake Bible Camp, and it was going to be, we were going to go in June of 1989. That's when we were going to go and be the directors. So the stories are phenomenal of God's leading and what God did with us.
So part of this podcast is just kind of that was not uncommon in that day of these camps that were being run by volunteers or part-timers or whatever. And there's this moment in time, which we don't even think about today in camping, because now it's going from this executive director to this executive director. That was a time where it went from kind of nobody as executive director to suddenly there's somebody for the first time ever that's in charge, living on the grounds and running this place from camp. Now, I do want to point out I think one of your first things that you did as executive director was let go of a brilliant intern, a brilliant maintenance man, and you said you can't be on staff anymore. I think I remember a story something along those lines.
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate. I'd like to tell you that the board grabbed a hold of me and said, get rid of James.
Yep.
But yes, because we got there and arrived and camp was struggling and we were going through everything else. And here is, and again, James, I have great respect and great love for you.
Yep.
And I watched what was happening, and I saw this young man with many talents, and we had you buried kind of in the corner.
Yeah, I would have never made it at the time. I thought, man, I'll be maintenance forever if I can stay at Bair Lake. That would have never worked. Just as an example, I actually filled a whole lawnmower with oil once, and just filled it to the top with oil and wrecked a brand new lawnmower that we got once. But maintenance wasn't my thing. It was a great thing that I was moved aside. So tell me, in that early stages, what was that like, taking a camp from no on-site director to somebody's here and somebody's leading this thing? What were those early years like? What were the hard or easy parts of doing what you did there?
I think the hardest part was, here was this guy who was coming in off of education and everything else, who really didn't understand Christian camping much at all. And trying to then understand what was going on and how things had fallen apart, because you're right. In the early days of Christian camping, you ran by the seat of your pants a whole lot bunch more.
Yep.
And I laugh because I asked about a job description, and it's almost like the board would look to me and said, "What's a job description? Just get here and do what's got to be done."
Yeah.
And people stepped up, and you did what needed to be done. And so as you walk through and trying to figure out all those things, and you had all these volunteers and trying to bring people together, identifying people's strengths and weaknesses and encouraging them to go after it with their uniqueness, but yet at the same time bringing it into a picture where the big picture is all on the same page. And that was a huge challenge. And then all of a sudden you came in and you find, oh, there are some legal papers that we should be filing. Oh, there should be a budget. Oh, there should be a health form making sure we're doing. And we had all of those things in very rough forms. And to take the next step was very challenging.
So was it the business side that was hard? Was it the spiritual side that was hard, or the people management? Or is it just a conglomeration of those things, trying to just establish a base to move forward with?
I think one of the great challenges is wherever you do, but for me it was identifying my strengths and understanding that I have weaknesses, and how am I going to cover those weaknesses, not hide them, but cover them. Mm-hmm. And so for me, at that point in time, Bair Lake needed somebody who was believable, somebody who was likable, and somebody who had some kind of vision. Mm-hmm. And I met those things very well. What I didn't meet very well was the administrative side of it. The payrolls, the budgeting, all the legal stuff and the licensing and all of those kinds of things. And so as I took those steps, I tried to take steps to bring people in as volunteers, and eventually starting to grow a staff that could do those things, especially the areas where I was weak in. Yeah. Now, in those first years, which I think is another thing as you're looking at historically, is Bair Lake Bible Camp, because people will look today and say, oh, look at Bob, you came in when it was hurting, and look, it's alive and vibrant. And I'd say, to God be the glory, to God be the glory, to God be the glory. And you better recognize Nancy Tissot, or else you're going to be in trouble.
Yeah.
Because Nancy served in all the roles, unpaid and anything else, because she had a better talent, better skills in some of those areas. And so she picked up areas that when I got there and discovered, we are not doing well in this area. Mm-hmm. And she says, I will pick it up and I will try to get it fixed and in place, so at least legally and things, we are moving in the right direction. We were legal, but we were always on the edge. Yeah. And we needed to get better. One of the state inspectors after the second year says, Bob, I got to give you credit. I thought this place was going to close in 3 years.
Wow.
And he says, it's being turned around. And I'd look and I'd say, you see that woman over there? A lot of the turnaround is from her. The second place the turnaround came from was the board. and looking to the board and saying, here are the areas that I am weak in, and we've got to do something. Who on the board has expertise and help that can at least, you don't have to do it, but you can at least lead us through the process to do it better.
So very hands-on board, operational board at the time?
Yes. When we started, and that goes into the history, a lot of camps were operational. Bair Lake was an operational board. The board set the things. They approved all the speakers. They approved almost everything, menus, the whole thing. And they came in, but that was starting to wear out the board.
Okay.
And part of my coming in was, can we get somebody who will do some of the day-to-day stuff that we don't, the menu stuff and things like that, that we don't have to have as much hands-on.
Okay.
And that was crucial to me. And as we talked about, and I talked with the board and the directors and the chairs of the board, we started to try to identify the kinds of people that would help us on the board and help us move forward. And we were in the process. Probably my third years, we moved to what was considered, we went from an operational board to a policy-making board.
That's really fast.
Yes. Now, you got to remember that Bair Lake was struggling, and the board was tired. And so the board in many ways was saying, yes, Bob, grab this and run with it. We don't have time nor the energy.
Wow.
And so as they did that, they almost became energized in areas where they were good at, that they could give time. We were still, quote, operational. So I started in the history of camping, I started off, my title was camp manager.
Oh, okay.
I was a camp manager. That was an operational term. You're the guy who manages things, but your boss is the board who does the operational stuff and tells you what to do. As we grew and developed, it became obvious to myself and the board that, I'm trying to say this the right way, humbly and everything else, it became obvious that I needed some more freedom to make decisions and run with things rather than having to go everything through the board.
Okay.
And so we had the conversation. And so about 3 years down the road, the board changed my title to executive director, a director rather than a manager. And so we ran that process. And again, for me, it wasn't, we are operational and tomorrow we are policy making. It was a process of moving through that. And there were people that did not work well with.
I think, again, so I'm a college age kid at the time, watching this from outside, still showing up on weekends and helping with junior staff with my wife, who you married us, by the way, pretty soon after that time. But and so we're coming in and out of Bair Lake all the time. What I remember seeing change in that time, again, I probably wasn't watching for the business side. It felt like Bair Lake was spiritually much more guided by having you in leadership in going, okay, this is what we're going to teach. This is where we're going to go. This is what we're going to try to do. Even with interns, this is what, you seem to bring a biblical set of goals and values in those early years that I felt, even as an outsider at that point, that, man, Bair Lake is going in the right direction. Was that something you spent a lot of time on as well?
I think that one of the weaknesses of the operational board is that there was nobody people could identify with. And when I went through those three things that I talked with the board about, I was likable, I was believable, and I had some vision. And when you start to express those things to people would resonate. And it's like, and again, it's not about me, but people would look and say, Bob. And it gave them someplace to identify with and get a better picture and a better focus on where we were headed. I brought certain skills. I did not have the great gift of administration, have the gift of teaching, the gift of pastoring, the gift of encouragement. And that's what Bair Lake really needed at that time.
When Koblish was on this podcast here a little while ago, he talked about a lot of the early camps have a personality, a magnetic personality that draw people to that facility to be volunteers to work. You definitely had that personality piece because of your interactions with people around you that brought people and brought more excitement around Bair, for sure, right?
That's right. People would say, "You're likable, Bob. We like you and we believe what you're doing." And again, to that whole thing of how do you do that? Then you have to work through, and I think that this is one of the, all through Christian camping, you got to work through your own ego at that part.
Yeah.
It is not about me. This is about what God is doing. Praise you, Lord. Thank you, Lord, that you are using me for your honor and glory, and help me to always remember that first, I am a follower of yours, and then I'm leading a place like Bair Lake Bible Camp. And that's a crucial thing, because so many people, when that happens and it's a person that becomes a focal, you can study the history of Christian camping. And when a person becomes the focal point, when that person leaves, the camp usually drops.
Yeah.
Because people have identified and that person is not there. Mm-hmm. And to be able to bring in a person who's focused on the Lord, in my words to everybody, and now we're towards my words towards my end of my time, is I looked at everybody and it's like, Bob, you've been here a lot of years, and I would look at them, I'd say, and my rallying cry at the end was, the best is yet to come. The best for Bair Lake Bible Camp is yet to come. The best for Bob Tissot, 29 years of Bair Lake Bible Camp as the director. For my personal life, I don't want to be a stupid old retired guy that sits back and does nothing and thinks about the past.
Yep.
The best is yet to come. And I think that the thing that came to Bair Lake when we came is I had a personality that people said, well, Bob is likable, he's believable, and boy, he's got some vision.
So I'm going to go back a little bit. So 30 years-ish, go to that middle section of time, 15 years in, the board's changed a little bit and become a little bit not day-to-day and a little bit more helping. The staff is starting to grow. Pieces are starting to get in place. What did that middle time feel like to a guy who's starting to understand the camp that he's running? What was that middle time like?
Confusing.
How so?
Trying to figure out God's best.
Okay.
One of my life mentors said to me, I'm not too afraid of you falling off the deep end, Tissot. I'm more concerned that you get caught up in doing so many good things that you'll miss God's best things. And so as you walk through this middle and you start to see it growing, and you start to see this, then you run into the challenge of, oh, good, we got it going now, just let it run. Instead of continuing to dream of, okay, Lord, is there something else? One of my prayers in those middle years, Lord, kill it. And people go like, what are you talking about? And my prayer was, Lord, if there's any program, anything that we're doing that has run its course, that has lived out its life, help me to have enough guts and enough determination to close it down or to make it better or to do whatever else, that I don't get caught in the trap of the same old, same old, same old.
Yeah.
And so those middle years, there was staff, our staff grew. When I got there, it was you, Ralph, and Matt.
Yep.
And within a short period of time, they all left.
Oh, yeah.
And then it was a matter of bringing in staff, and how do you add more staff, and who do you bring in? How do you bring in? We were a heavy-duty volunteer-based camp, which is a beauty of the teaching of that we all are gifted. We are all part of the priesthood. And we all need to come and give of ourselves. At the same time, as it grew, it became more important that we have things in place to do things right, because that is to the honor and glory of God. And to just run a thing where, and again, Bob Tissot's personality, I just love everybody. And it's like, that's great, Bob, but you better have the right pieces in place for people's safety, for the security of the ministry, for all those things. And that's what I call, and again, that's the history of camping. It starts off a ton with personality. And then you get to the organization. And so for me, because I was very people-oriented and people-driven, I went to a board and looked for a board and talked to board members that also had better eyes for protecting the organization than I did.
Yeah.
And that was a key thing in the success during those middle years. One of the board members, a lawyer, and we'd go to board meetings and I'd be just love everybody, and he'd go, "No, we got to do blah, 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 blah."
Yeah.
And I looked at him one time and I just looked at him and I said, "Jeff," I says, "I need you." And he just looked at me and kind of laughed. And I said, "I need you with the eye to the organization to make sure the organization is doing things right. Because if we do things wrong, we're going to be in trouble."
Yeah.
And I said, "Thank you so much." I said, "Because sometimes we're going to bump heads a little bit, but I need you." And I'll never forget, because he turned and looked at me and he says, "And don't you ever stop telling people the stories. Don't ever stop telling me the stories about how lives are being changed, because sometimes I can get so caught up in seeing the organization that I miss seeing the faces of the people."
And that's every camp has that dilemma to some point, because you get these figureheads that are deep in it or not deep in it, but they're just the known entities of the camp. And then there's these minions and millions of them all around them that are doing all these details that are actually how the camp's running, and you are just the person actually just walking around telling the stories, that you're not even the one standing there in the cabin anymore, but you're hearing this great story. And then you get to take that great story and own it and out to the people and out to the donors and all that kind of stuff. So it's an interesting kind of two different things going on there in Bear Lake. In that middle time, things are really successful. And you start working on purity and holiness, and you start working on silence and solitude. Tell me about those things a little bit.
Well, in the process of all this, and again, you go back to my background as a teacher, a coach, and then a counselor, and a heart for people. And so we would start talking through things. And one of the first programs that we developed was a program called A Call to Purity and Holiness, a biblical perspective on relationships. So what does the Bible talk about in relationships? And that became a very popular program. And matter of fact, we've talked about Bob Koblish a couple times. Here's Bob Koblish. I went to the National Christian Camping Conference, and Bob, as the director of 3CA at the time, said, "Bob, would you go up and just share a little bit about your purity and holiness program?" And I said, "Sure, I'd be happy to." And so I went up and shared about it. The person after me was a guy named Alexander Karatanov, the president of Christian Camping in Russia. And he got up and to do his thing and talking about Christian camping in Russia. And he looked at me and he said, "Before I say anything else, Bob Tissot, we need you to come to Russia and teach this program to us." And that was all through Koblish's invitation to come.
Wow.
And so that program became a kind of a key program, one of our key retreats. And a lot of it was talking about things then that we were teaching staff in staff training and how to treat people, how to be alive and vibrant. And then I began to get invitations to go to churches and other camps and other places to teach the program. And it was a program that just, it was awesome. And there's so many stories.
In my 27 years here, we've used that a piece of that for our staff training every year, up till this last year in training our staff. So there's things that you put together with I'm blanking on his name.
Alex Rahill.
Yeah, Alex Rahill. You put together with Alex that still is having an effect on camps today, which is really, really cool. Now, so did I miss anything in that middle section that was different than in the beginning?
Well, we were talking. Then you said the Silence and Solitude program. Because the Silence and Solitude program is, again, a program that I wrote called The Sanity of Silence and Solitude. And a Christian camping leader came that was on the national board and asked me the question, Bob, why do you think it is so many Christian leaders are crashing and burning? Why do you think so many? And we just had a thing in Christian camping where a few directors had been let go because of stuff. And I looked at him and I said, because we have lost the ability to be alone and quiet before God. And they said, you need to teach on that. And so I began putting together, and the idea of it is that in Christian camping, from the beginning, even until now, it's about do. There are 5,621 things to do today, and there's another list of things that aren't done that should still get done. And we can get so caught up in doing that we forget that we are in Christ. I be in Christ. And there's a difference between being and doing. And so for me, it ended up being a time where I went on, well, I call it the blip, bloop, badoomp. Very theological there, you know?
Yeah, I like it.
Blip is each day I should have a time alone and quiet with my Lord. Bloop is that once a week there's a Sabbath rest. Jesus created 6 days, the seventh day, or God, on the seventh day he rested. And then there's the badoomp. And the badoomp is what I've tried to practice is once a year for a 2 to 4 day time I go alone and for a time alone and quiet before God. And trying to calm myself and get my head together that I am in Christ. And if all I do is get caught up in doing, I will burn myself out. And so that became a program that became very successful. And again, I got to do some traveling and encourage people. And there's some great stories, and even in my own life, of you get so caught up in doing things that you forget to sit down and just be in Christ.
And I know there's a lot of people in the Minnesota section that have heard that.
Yep.
And Doug Payne at Miracle Bible Camp, he'd let me come over and hide at his place for a couple days, and there's a few of us, and so that was that had a huge impact on a lot of camp leaders. Is that 90s? Is that 2000 or 2000s?
98.
98?
That's when the program first got written, I think.
Wow. But I know that's had a huge effect on camp leaders all over the country, and something that it's another reminder I should do it this year. But I sure appreciate that. Now, so that's that middle time at Bair. You're able to have some influence in camps all over because of CCCA. Hopefully we'll talk about that another time. But then you're getting towards your latter years at Bair. What's changed? What's the big difference between years 1 through 15 in the last 15?
For me, it became the thing of when is the right time for the old guy to get out of the way to make sure I'm opening the door for young people. One of my criticisms of what I've seen too often within the Christian culture is that the old people take over and they will never give it up. And the young people end up leaving and going other places. And so I wanted to make sure that I didn't outlast my value to the organization. Said I'd rather get out when things are going well than to get out because somebody tells you got to get out because you just don't have it anymore.
That feels a little coaching, like the football player that knows that he's lost a step and it's time to get off the field kind of a thing.
Yep. And you walk through that trying to understand, because I think I could have stayed I was 67 when I got out. I could have stayed. So what we did is I began talking to the board, there's a day coming. So about 5 years before, when I'm in early 60s, we just started talking about, do we have any kind of transition plan or what's this going to look like? There is a day coming that I'm going to be gone. I am going to have a history here. People are going to look and people are going to say, whoa, I don't know if I want to follow up behind him. And so we began to talk, and we just started, and the board wrote at that point for a new policy for us And it was simply called a plan of succession. And we had a general plan of when Tissot decided that the time was getting close, here's what we would kick into gear. Mm-hmm. And I'm so thankful for that. For me, when it came to the point that I kind of said, I think this is it, I think it's time for me to get out, is I remember sitting in my office looking out through the slider door, and across was the thing that we call the stand, which is a pole that people climbed up on and they jumped off of it and all of these things. And of course, you got all the right equipment on and all those kind of things. And I watched, in my early years, I watched kids scared to death to go up there. And I watched people encourage them, and I watched them take one step at a time and make great progress. I remember a father coming out who was working in the kitchen, and his daughter was scared, and he stood at by the pole, and he encouraged her, and he cheered for her. And when she jumped off, he just hugged her and everything. And I thought, this is awesome. And then one day I started to look out, and I looked out there, and I said, I wonder if that's safe enough. I wonder if we're going to get sued. And I started, instead of seeing the faces of kids that were growing and being so excited, I started to see all the horror that could happen. And I became so concerned about that. And I said, I think I'm getting close to the time to step out. So I began talking with people and went through all kinds of things. And I tell the story of, I was praying about it, and I had prayer teams and all this thing. People were praying, when's the right time for Bob to go? And people would come up to me and they'd say, Bob, we're just praying that God will make it very clear to you when's the right time to go. Mm-hmm. And I'd say, thank you very much. And then one day I'm sitting in my office and I'm praying, I'm being alone and quiet before the Lord, and just kind of pouring it out to him. And it's like, and this story came through my mind, and okay, I didn't hear a voice from the Lord, but it came, and it was like, Bob, if I sent a plane across Bair Lake right now, and on the back of the plane was a banner, and the banner said, now is the time, Bob, would that be enough proof to you that it's time? I'm kind of chuckling and laughing, going like, of course it would be. And then I went like, no? Because I may look out there and say, I wonder if that's me, Bob, or if that's the Bob across the lake. Mm-hmm. And it's like the Lord said to me, Bob, you're going to have to step out in faith. Are you willing to step out in faith? And so there were all kinds of things that I had people I talked to, people I met with, trying to determine my life mentors and talking to them and making those decisions. And then it came to the point where I gave the board, and the board chair knew these things, but I said, at this meeting, I'm telling you, I'll be done. The plan of succession called for 6 months. They asked for 6 months notice. I gave them a year notice. And people say, how does that work and everything else? That's a huge blessing, because Bair Lake Bible Camp is vibrant and alive today. In many ways, it is more dynamic than when I was there. And people go like, well, don't you feel bad about that? And I said, absolutely not. That was my prayer. The best is yet to come. And could I take steps as the outgoing guy with 30-year history that Bair Lake grew a ton? Two of the greatest compliments I got from the founders before they died. And they put their armor on me and they said, this is more than we ever dreamt of.
Wow.
And I go, praise God, from whom all camps do flow. And as you go through that and you understand that, is this ability to walk away and yet say, Lord, I want to be used of you, but I don't want to get in the way. Mm-hmm. And again, we can go through all kinds of things. And some of the stories that happened 6 weeks after I left. There was an explosion and all the plans and all of those kinds of things. The new director, Drew, has said to me, Bob, you can come up to Bair Lake Bible Camp anytime you want. And I've looked at him and said, Drew, wisdom says I just don't come up here anytime I want. and trying to understand the dynamics of it all, because I'm more concerned that Bair Lake grows and offers up the message of Jesus Christ to a world that desperately needs it than that Bob Tissot go and get some attention.
Well, I want to start to close, but before we do that, I just need to say, in you and I have known each other for just a little while, but you have been one of the main mentors in my life, in that you've been somebody that I could go to multiple times, either on the phone or meeting at nationals or emailing back and forth, that I've been able to go to in times where I've been struggling in ministry. I remember a national at I think we were in Colorado, and you were sicker than a dog. And I remember your wife bringing you to talk to me in an evening, because I was going through something as program director here, and I needed some advice. And I remember you were sicker than a dog. And I remember your wife, Nancy, who I love, being your watchdog and saying, James, you've got this many minutes, and taking those minutes. And whenever we met over the years, you've been somebody that can just look right into my life and say, James, here's the 5 things you're doing wrong, and here's the one thing you're doing right, I hope. And you've just been such a great person for me to go to and get guidance and understanding, and I appreciate it. And I think in sharing your time at Bair Lake is a great example for the people watching to go, man, this wasn't easy back in the day, but man, amazing things happened. And so I just want to say I appreciate your ministry in my life, and I appreciate your ministry at Bair.
To God be the glory, to God be the glory, to God be the glory. Is that over and over again? Thank you, James. I have been privileged to be part of your life. And most of the time, at least. But as I go through, and it's like, how can I, as an older person now, simply sit back and encourage people and come alongside of them and say, the old guy just wants to encourage you. I don't want to tell you what to do, how to do it, and all those kinds of things. But at the same time, I want to put my arm around you and said, number one, do not grow weary in doing good. There's a harvest if we refuse to give up, because you spend enough time in Christian camping, and there are going to be days that discouragement knocks on your door.
Yeah.
And weariness is there, and you say, I just want to quit. You say, help me, Lord. And to have somebody in your life that can sit there and just say, I'm cheering and praying like crazy. I always tell people at 74 years old, my cheering is kind of ugly and usually results in me having to go to a chiropractor the next day. My praying is pretty dynamic, pretty good.
Yep. Well, I sure appreciate it. And thanks for joining us today, Bob.
Thank you so much for having me.